This is the Tom Bigby Tales, and I'm your host, Shannon Evans. I write about a small town in northeast Mississippi on the Tom Bigby River, as well as I often write about the rest of the state. This episode is about Blewett Harrison Lee, the son of Confederate General Stephen D. Lee. Blewett Harrison Lee was born March 1st, 1867, to former Confederate General Stephen D. Lee and his wife, Regina Lily Harrison, in Columbus, Mississippi. Blewett grew up in what would become known as Hickory Sticks, a beautiful home on a hillside in a part of Columbus that is now called 7th. Blewett attended A&M College in Starkville, Mississippi, now called Mississippi State, where his father was the president, and he graduated at the age of 15 as valedictorian of his class. Blewett then went on to attend the University of Virginia to get his initial law degree before attending Harvard to study law and to get his LLB. While at UVA, he was made the editor of the Virginia University Student Magazine. Then, at Harvard, Lee left a lasting impression on his fellow classmates and faculty members alike because of his brilliance and his Southern gentility, what we in the South call our manners. At Harvard, Lee helped fellow students, including the future Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, to found the student-edited Harvard Law Review. Lee then left for Europe and continued his studies at Freiburg and then Leipzig universities. When he returned to the States, he settled into his first job as the clerk to Chief Justice Gray of the U.S. Supreme Court. After clerking for Gray, he lectured at Atlanta Law School from 1891 to 1893 before moving to Chicago to be a professor at Northwest University Law School, before moving to teach at the University of Chicago Law School as one of their original founding faculty members. And he also served at that time as the chief counsel for the Illinois Central Railroad. In 1898, he married a Chicago socialite and heiress to the international harvester fortune, Frances Glessner. After a honeymoon trip in a fancy train car to San Francisco, the pair settled in Atlanta, Georgia, where Blewett began private practice as an attorney. The two would have 3 children before divorcing in 1914. I'll write more on Frances later in another podcast episode. She would go on to be a notable pioneer in forensic science, specifically in crime scene analysis. Despite Blewett Lee's prominence as general counsel for a major railroad, he would become most known for a significant article in Aviation Law published in 1913, titled Sovereignty of the Air. This would be published in the American Journal of International Law. He argued that railroad law should be considered in the regulation of aviation law, as it had set a precedence. He would present his paper in 1913 to the Alabama Bar, the Tennessee Bar, and the Mississippi Bar. Despite aviation being in its infancy, Lee was one of the first legal minds to recognize potential aviation travel issues that mirrored the same or similar issues in rail travel. Lee worked to establish and extend aviation laws across the country to include licensing of planes and pilots, flight paths, and maneuvers allowed while over certain airspace, etc. Much of his work has now been applied to drone flights in even recent years, so his work has set precedents and continues. Perhaps the most interesting legal opinions and papers Lee published were in more esoteric fields on the peripheral edges of free speech and freedom of religion as it relates to spiritualism movement in the early 1900s. While there probably were fraudulent spiritualists at the time, as well as probably now, in the early 1900s, statutes were introduced to ban spiritualist practices considered fortune-telling, like frentalist and palmist, despite the 1879 ruling that had occurred in Reynolds versus U.S. that stated that free exercise of religion applies to all beliefs and thus protectable. At the time of Blewett Lee's publications and opinions, many of the spiritual practitioners in some more hazy categories of those deemed magic and fanaticism at that time might actually have been sincere religionists. Blewett's series of articles in the 1920s addressed legal concerns regarding religious freedom and fortune telling, conjuring, seances, etc., as they related to existing law. His articles exposed the religious biases, primarily Protestant biases, in legislation and judicial decisions related to these more esoteric believers. Blewett developed the first version of the sincerity test, a test used extensively in U.S. Supreme Court issues, including those like the U.S. versus Ballard in 1944, that are used to make sure heresy trials would remain absent from our court system. Religious freedoms include not the fact that religious falsehoods might exist, according to Lee. Rather, did the person believe it to be true at the time, or was there an intent to deceive others? Blewett encouraged legal and medical minds to examine the science of mediums and soothsayers, and stated that they were not necessarily frauds, but could be keyed in more in depth with their own mind than the average person, and thus more receptive to phenomenon around them. Blewett would spend the rest of his life in Atlanta, Georgia, dying at the age of 84. He's buried in Columbus, Mississippi at Friendship Cemetery next to his father. Thank you for coming on my little tour of Columbus, Mississippi, and our stories and our people and the Tom Bigby tales. Until next time.